Good evening, good afternoon. Bonsoir tout le monde. John, thank you very much for this judicious introduction. I was asked to speak about Haitian history and Haitian culture in 20 minutes. And it's a daunting task to talk about 20 decades of history in 20 minutes. So I had pretty much prepared a long version of a paper, just in case if I would be the only speakers, if the other speakers would not have made it, and prepare a very short one also. So I think I'm going to proceed with the short one. Can you hear me there? Okay, sure. I'll try to project because students sometimes tell me that I speak too soft and I don't project, but I'll try to project today. The title of my paper is Coping with Disaster Between the Collective Dream and the Historical Nightmare. I chose this title particularly in line of looking at Haitian history and culture as, in fact, an important aspect in trying to understand what happened to Haiti after January 12 and of course, to put things in perspective historically. Often people say, well, we've known the history, we heard about this before, but I think it's important as we're looking at how we're going to help Haiti in the future in terms of coping with particularly long-term strategies and short-term strategies, to be able to reflect on some of the past, at least in the memories, knowing what we know about Haiti and how Haiti got where it is right now. I'll proceed with the short version, in the interest of time. Haiti has been coping with multiple concurrent disasters for many decades. It is indeed true that the January 12 disaster has highlighted conditions which existed in the last 2 decades, but even before that. However, Haiti as a nation is vulnerable and precarious in many important aspects. Any attempt, or particularly sociological attempt, or anthropological attempt to comprehend how Haiti and Haitians have been coping with disasters, and also to understand the long-term strategies for rebuilding the society, must examine the 3 fundamental elements of the nation's history and their psychological effect on Haitian culture and the nation. We have those slides particularly for folks who try to position Haiti, try to understand Haiti's history in the global context, particularly looking at Haiti within the context of the Caribbean and the Americas and the rest of the world. Now, as I said, the 3 fundamental elements to understand Haiti's history and culture. These 3, this is Haiti at the post-earthquake. These 3 fundamental elements, in any order, or what we sometimes refer to as these 3 pillars, the independence, 1804 revolution, the language, Creole, the religion, Voodoo. These 3 pillars, inextricably linked to the political, culture, and social formation of this nation, are the basic coping mechanism used from its very beginning to the present. We will not address all these 3 elements. We'll try to spend some time looking at the independence, the meaning of the independence, the significance of the independence, and its aftermath. And we'll say a few words about the other 2 elements. Why they're important? Because they reflect pretty much the cultural capital of the nation and how people in Haiti move, dance, do art, express their feelings, their sorrows. As we've seen this afternoon, the 2 students who presented the choreographed dance, looking at the culture in terms of the movement, movement that you find in Voodoo dance, the language itself express certain elements that are very important. Now, in sharing my understanding of the impact of Haitian history and culture within the larger context of the Caribbean, I'll focus again my brief remarks on the significance of the independence in 1804 and its aftermath. One of the significance of the Haitian Revolution has been the creation of a tradition of solidarity around the globe. What do we mean by that? Immediately after the independence, Haiti embarked itself on a number of acts of solidarity. The ideals of the revolution, which was liberté, égalité, fraternité, was a dream, a collective dream, enshrined in the motto of l'union fait la force, became a nightmare historically, as we will see. But importantly, that tradition of global solidarity, as you know, began in Haiti prior to its independence. From 1773, we've seen how Haiti sent 1,500 free blacks and mulattoes who came to the U.S., and particularly in Savannah, Georgia, to fight for the independence of this nation. Among the volunteers who came, there were the young Henry Christophe, who became one of the Haiti's independence heroes and the king in the north. We also seen act of solidarity in 1808 when Haiti sent aid, particularly under Pétion and Christophe. They sent food and financial aid to Dominican patriot Juan Sanchez, who was leading the fight against Spanish colonialism. We also seen the solidarity from Haiti after its independence, when particularly the Haitian leaders sent aid to South American struggle against Spanish colonialism. In other words, you wouldn't have Simon Bolivar if you didn't have Haiti, because particularly in 1815, Alexandre Pétion gave vital assistance to Simon Bolivar that enabled him to relaunch his campaign for South American independence. And Pétion demanded as payment that the planter aristocrat Bolivar declare slavery in his homeland abolished, which he did on his return to South America. Now, in early 1816, again, Bolivar asked for more support, which he got from Pétion to continue the struggle. But one of the things that Bolivar did was to free all the slaves, which Pétion asked him. Again, we can see this type of solidarity that Haitian leaders were doing, particularly to sustain and maintain their own revolution and independence, was an act of not charity, but rather act of good deed. And the Haitian leaders didn't ask much. They simply asked to liberate other slaves. In modern days, many countries would look for a certain reciprocity in terms of, asking for more in terms of resources and so forth. We've also seen in 1816, again, in October 1816, on a request from Mexican General Francisco Javier Mina, Haitians sent many volunteers to fight against the Spanish colonialism. We've seen later in 1821, Haiti sent aid to the Greeks struggling against Turkish occupation. When Papa Flesas called for Greeks to rebel, some patriots, among them Polinio Conades and Cloranes, they obtained arms, volunteers from Haiti, led by Panayota. They landed on the island of Hydra to fight Turkish occupiers. In return, in 1935, Princess Marina of Greece visited Haiti to express her country's gratitude for Haiti's contributions to the struggle against Turkish domination. We've seen again Haiti in 1830, aid to Belgium's struggle for independence. In 1830, particularly, Belgian revolutionaries received the support of the Haitian government in the struggle for independence. After victory, the Belgians adopted Haiti's motto, national motto, l'union fait la force, and unity there is strength. Now, one could say, in fact, there were great deeds that Haitian leaders, accomplished right after the independence, and as a way to create solidarity around the world, which I usually tell friends, it's also important to understand that independence does not automatically, not necessarily imply the birth of the nation, because the emergence of a national consciousness is a long and laborious process that involves the implementation of a unified vision mobilized around a common ideal, a common project, a common dream, and a common pursuit. Since 1804, what was observed immediately after independence, the state and the ruling classes have reproduced the same patterns of exclusion and subjugation of the rural and popular masses in the nation's political affairs. The embryonic state was formed against the peasant class and farmers, which further marginalized them and disenfranchised them from the collective dream. This was done under the pejorative designation of Monan de Yo, the outside world. The phenomenon of a collective dream around a larger project of unity and modernity was never able to materialize under the weight of negative effects of the extreme social divide. The irritating differences and exacerbated antagonism from 1804 to the present have often seemed overwhelmingly due to the persistence of internal quarrels, caste, closed categories of constant social historical atomism, along with the damaging foreign political influences filled with strong hostility and racism. The dramatic underachievement of Haiti remains an indisputable historical fact, despite the existence of a territory, a population, a state, and a government. The territory has never been administered with love, efficiency, transparency, rationality, and accountability. Instead, it has been impoverished in the course of 20 decades by indifference and irresponsibility. Now, it's important to understand that, in fact, as I mentioned, those three elements, how they impact Haitian history, it is also to look at how Haiti's revolution has, in fact, been a major turning point in the region. Napoleon Bonaparte stated, and I quote, "My decision to destroy the authority of the blacks in Saint-Domingue is not so much based on consideration of commerce and money as on the need to block forever the march of the blacks in the world." In other words, the Haitian Revolution was not only the reclamation of agency for the slaves of Saint-Domingue, it was also the deadly implosion and explosion of the wealthiest slave colony in the world, the bursting of the very heart of the Atlantic slave trade, which shaped Western societies and their relationship for 2 centuries to come. This eruption is twofold in its narrative. From one perspective, that of historical materialism, it can be seen that the Haitian Revolution marked the beginning of the end of European world hegemony and the rise of the United States as a developing international power. While this perspective is valid and useful, it is also an ego-driven discourse, especially with regards to the development of American-Haitian relations. It is, moreover, a hierarchical viewpoint. Hence, it fundamentally misrepresents whatever privative society turns its gaze upon. The other eruption, more truly a bursting out, is that of the primary and immediate claim of the Haitian people to their own lives, both individually and collectively. This perspective, commonly known as the bottom-up perspective, which I will rename revolutionary determinism, because from it emerged great victories and also unbelievable disasters. Because defeating the best soldiers Europe could throw at them, the Haitian revolutionaries, under the guidance of such archetypal characters as Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, were the physical manifestation of revolutionary determinism. The island reared its fearsome head as a protest against decades of torment and enslavement, and the chains were broken under the weight of the honorable dead. Haiti became, for a time, synonymous with liberty for the oppressed. But for the European powers, it was a nuisance, a threat, the living example of revolutionary determinism in the hearts of the Negro, and that the European world point when defending slavery. Though they considered the black subhuman, there was not a slave owner in the Western world who did not shudder upon hearing of the revolution in Saint-Domingue. Now, Zora Neale Hurston once asked the following question, unquote, "But what can a weak country like Haiti do when a powerful nation like your own forces its military upon us, kills our citizens, and steals our monies?" This question posed by Hurston helps us to be mindful of three historical facts. First, Haitian history is marked by a succession of disastrous failures that have resulted in the destruction of the collective dream. The idea of the model state, based on the ideals of liberté, égalité, and fraternité, that was the collective dream generated by national unity, which produced the 1804 revolution. This ideal had quickly become a historical nightmare by squandering the human capital and material wealth. Second, Haiti's political and social institutions have been enduringly linked to global economy and geopolitical forces, eroding the sovereignty, autonomy, and ability of Haitian leadership in the state and civil society, as well as the Haitian diaspora, to set their own priorities. Third, the contemporary Haitian state is rooted in slave economics and militarism and exploitation, and has perpetuated the historical relationship left behind by the French after the revolution. Power equals exploitation. The state apparatus in Haiti has perpetuated itself for 2 centuries by feeding off the Haitian people in this context. Now I'm going to move into the next section that I mentioned, which I will briefly talk about the issues of the religion and the language. I call this section Uneven Cultural Capital on the Making of Haiti. Jennifer McCoy once reminds us that, unquote, "We are all in the same boat, and this boat is not going to Florida." The history of Haiti, as I mentioned, is one of sharply contrasting and opposed interests, starkly competing visions of state and nation, and a rigid class structure. If the Haitian mind or attitude is meant to signify the political, economic, and social position of the majority, Haitians have been of one attitude only twice in their history. Their first coming together as a people was in the period between 1791 and 1804, when they bravely united against slavery and French colonialism. The second was in 1990, when a majority of at least 67% elected Jean-Bertrand Aristide to the presidency of the country, in the country's first democratic and free election. Events since that election, however, reflect the deep divisions that develop in this society between these two defining moments. While pride in the historical accomplishment allows Haitians to think of themselves as one nation, despite the yawning social gulf that divides the top from the bottom, this same pride also creates an inward focus that prevents many Haitians from learning from others. All Haitians embrace Africa, which is the bond of brotherhood with Black Africans. Nevertheless, a small number of educated Haitians have always shared the European paternalistic denigration of things African. The fundamental issue is how to create a sense among Haitians that they are all in the same boat, and that if one group or class goes overboard, the whole boat will sink. The problem is that Haitian elites honestly believe and have believed for a century and a half that they can survive without the poor, the rural majority of Haiti. Class structure, not merely income, and historical ties, not simply the immediate past, are at the root of Haiti's modern disaster. Indeed, a positive resolution of this disaster is impossible unless these cultural and historical issues are understood and confronted. The solution, as Wolf Trujillo points out, involves a social contract between the state and society, which lays out the obligation of each to the other. For Haiti, as for most post-colonial societies, the state preceded the nation at independence. But unlike other emerging democracies, the Haitian state did not achieve a social contract that could produce a sense of national identity politics. Instead, throughout the 19th century, Haiti, elites reacted to the rise of the peasantry not with a package of social benefits that would have led the majority to believe that they were actually in the same boat as the elite, but with a form of social apartheid. Elites have believed that they could survive even if the majority did not. Thus, a sense of sameness across class lines, a sense of nationhood was never achieved in Haiti. This cultural divide among Haitians has created an internalized violence in relation to the ethnic diversity of the population. Variations in skin color are perhaps the most real of the agents of cultural strife. There exists in Haiti a historical tension between the older mulatto elite and the black middle class. This is a complex issue. However, no aspect of Haitian history is more confusing than the physical appearance of its people. Haiti is said to be divided by color, but that is a gross simplification. It is closer to the truth to say that consciousness of color varies between social classes and also within each class, and that for many people, light skin is symbolically important. But this statement merely skims the surface. The skin color of people must be seen as part of a perceptual whole that includes hair type, nose type, lip type, eye color, ear size, and other features, such as amount of body and facial hair and body type. As important as color is to Haitians, however, it is not clear that this factor determines the identification, that emergence of a ruling class, so much as did education, military records, and personal connections. Thus, while color is a significant cultural issue, it was not at the birth of the nation, nor today so neatly a defining marker that social groups can safely be described in color terms. Similarly, variation in the use of language is one manifestation of cultural division. All Haitians speak Haitian Creole to one degree or another. 8 to 10% of the population, the educated elite, speak French well enough to claim fluency. However, only a tiny minority within the elite is truly bilingual in both French and Haitian Creole. More important than bilingualism is the messages given to the elite children that it is unacceptable for members of the class to speak Creole, thus maintain a continuous divide at the linguistic and social level. The lack of clear and concerted communication around issues that affect everyone's life is very much lacking. Furthermore, the language mismatch of schooling and knowledge between the majority rural poor, the bulk of the population, and the minority urban elite further reinforced the social inequity, since access to knowledge for enhancing the quality of life is not accessible in the majority language. How do we sustain the transfer of knowledge of cultural importance to the population most affected, and which has the potential and capacity to self-transform? Until the late 1980s, French was the only official language in schools and in the court system. And this way, language is an effective tool for creating a social barrier that denies majority participation in certain state institutions. 90% of Haitians are thus excluded from power. Furthermore, there are subtle nuances and meaning within Haitian Creole that illustrate cultural prejudices and cynicism. For example, the word l'État in Creole means both the state and bully. The urban people, in turn, refer to the rural peasant as Mounandeyo, which means outsiders. Languages, particularly the hegemony of French versus Creole, manifests itself in the cultural divide as a marker of status and a tool of domination. Whether one imagines hegemony to be relatively open or relatively closed, the essence of the concept is not manipulation but legitimating. The ideas, values, and experiences of dominant groups are validated in public discourse. Those of subordinate groups are not. Though they may continue to thrive beyond the boundaries of received opinion, we know that in fact it is a cultural impediment. Given this culture of silence created by the French language hegemony, there can be no discourse or debate on important issues that affect the life and well-being of the majority because of the minority's greed and irresponsibility using state resources. The very things that brought Haitians together are the very things that keep them apart. Language and religion help the Haitian peasant to face the power deficit between master and slave, oppressor and oppressed, and the dominant Europe and the subaltern Africa. In both Haitian language and Haitian religion, one finds the necessary compromise and subterfuge to the weak to use to survive. Now, it's important as we looked at and try to move a little faster, that in fact try to think in terms of long-term strategic opportunities for transformation in Haiti. The two greatest obstacles to a productive change for Haiti are intimately linked: the international presence and resource availability. By international presence, I also, as well as the perception of Haitians' dependency on that presence. It was once mentioned to me that Haitians may be the world's greatest libertarian. An informal economy and a dysfunctionally and uninvolved state are ideal conditions for a libertarian nation, albeit an impoverished one. The island's difficulty arises in several ways. First, Haitian land is simultaneously unequally distributed and inefficiently used. Much of the island population live on agriculture, growing on their own small plot of land for personal consumption and small sales in local market space. Furthermore, the land that is actually productive cannot compete with foreign food dumping. Excessive importation of cheap staples such as rice undercut any potential for profit. These harsh economic conditions have created room for a negative collective dependency to transpire. Unprofitable, inefficient production and resource scarcity has led to a necessary international presence and a massive influx of aid, which is meant to help the Haitian people. Unfortunately, I do not have the space to statistically analyze the benefits of such aid for Haiti, but suspicions are lingering, and lingering suspicions provide the grounds for popular discontent, dissent, and ultimately a total change. So far, as I have used psychology, sociology, and anthropology to present a holistic picture of Haiti and its disaster, but Haitians are a hopeful people. Haitians, though, are a hopeful people, for when one has nothing, one has only hope. Yet, hope is blind and passive without pride, which eventually generates a future vision. The grounds for change for Haiti may take many forms, but it must take form before the island will change. Now, lastly, what I'd like to say is to perhaps begin to think about the whole issue about changes in Haiti and how we're going to impact those changes. As we embark on the solidarity with Haitians to help rebuild the nation toward a new direction of transparent and accountable development, we all must keep in mind the very first day of our nation. Because on the eve of 1804, the situation must have looked extremely bleak. All the towns were destroyed in 13 years of war. All the plantations were burned down. Yet, in just 16 years, from 1804 to 1820, the cities were rebuilt, roads were restored, waterworks were completed, palaces and churches were erected, new fortifications, including the citadel, dominated the land. At the time, there was no help from any international community to be counted on. Everything had to be done on the bronze and the brains of Haitians. I'd like to end perhaps with the challenge to say that, in fact, Yes, 30% of the countries have been affected, but the remainder 70% still, is usable. Because in other words, when people look at Haiti, taking that there are still 70% that are still living 8 of the 10th department, they in fact understand that the whole country is not totally destroyed. And as we try to rebuild the country, it must be also done in the context of not rebuilding Port-au-Prince, but rebuilding Haiti as a total. Finally, I think it's important to remember that the challenge is to get those Haitians abroad and the friends of Haiti to double their commitment and to invest a comparable amount for a collective project of national reconstruction. Their willingness to do such a deed will gradually rise if they can see a well-structured and absolutely transparent blueprint that gives them a stake in one or more viable projects over time. One such project might be the design and construction of new schools, new housing that not only can survive earthquake and hurricane, but that is also affordable. Another project may seek to be put in place a network of community banks, the emergence of urban development zone, which cannot occur without such a network, I think is also important. But beyond the necessary financial resources, a huge transfer of knowledge is needed to take place to fill in the gap that left many skilled professionals who died in the earthquake, perhaps also who have moved abroad prior to the earthquake. I'd like to end here, giving the time, and then open for any questions as we get into the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, John Ford, for this opportunity for me to pull some thoughts together and also to learn from my colleagues. I'm going to keep my remarks as schematic and declaratory as I can, hoping that there will be time for questions and discussion to fill in lots and lots of blanks. I want to talk about education, past, present, and future in Haiti as what I would suggest is probably the greatest development opportunity in the country right now. And like Dr. Prue, it began on a word of hope. The spirit that I come in here was well expressed by economist Paul Collier last October in a report to the Secretary General of the United Nations, which prophetically was titled Haiti from Natural Catastrophe to Economic Security, before this national catastrophe. Some of you might know Paul Collier by his book, The Bottom Billion, which is an extraordinary profile of those countries, including Haiti, that development has left behind. Collier wrote last October, in stark contrast to the other current entanglements with fragile states, Haiti offers the American and Canadian governments a rare opportunity to demonstrate that their support can lift a society decisively out of fragility. Haiti is not hopeless, he wrote, but the demands are urgent. The youth tsunami in Haiti is accelerating the process of environmental degradation and adding to the potentially explosive pool of underemployed youth, which speaks to his purpose, one of his purposes and perspectives in the report that he presented for the Secretary General. The premise that I would bring to you is, and this may sound so trite now that it's even a little heartless, is that we can't waste this crisis. We hear about the destruction of 2,800 schools. We hear about the deaths of 6,000 university students in Port-au-Prince, 200 professors. And the first instinct is rebuild, as if physical structures were themselves education, as if they were curriculum, educational opportunity, standards, prepared teachers. To simply rebuild, I think of as pouring oil into an old car rather than installing new rings or swapping out the whole engine. This really is a moment of opportunity and challenge for some deep systemic changes, which I think are quite consistent at large with the results also of the International Donors Conference, sponsored on March 31st by the UN, the government of Haiti, and the United States. I want to give a word or two about the perspective that I and my organization bring to this. John has already said a bit about who we were. EDC was founded at MIT in the 1950s by a nuclear physicist who was deeply, deeply concerned about the scientific illiteracy of American students. And out of that came large curriculum development projects, the Physical Sciences Studies Committee, that affected at least half of all school students in the United States. 4 textbooks, 50 films, trained 6,000 teachers. The motivation in that age of Sputnik and McCarthyism wasn't just to keep up with the Russians and to be internationally competitive, but it was really to deliver on the ideal and the promise of Thomas Jefferson, when in 1850 he created his plan for the dispersion of knowledge within the state of Virginia and developed an education hierarchy that was predicated on universal basic education at public expense for all students, and an opportunity for a meritocracy to emerge, which would then have as its apogee the University of Virginia. In the mind of Thomas Jefferson and his counterparts at that time, who were deeply affected by English social contract law, the premises for functioning democracies are intellectual and economic independence. At that time, it was for yeoman farmers, for simple agrarians, but who would be independent enough from markets to think for themselves and to vote on matters of public importance and function as a democracy. And that core, which we don't talk much about in the work that EDC does today, I think still pervades our work and is a motivation for why we are in Haiti at this point. EDC has had activities in Haiti for about 20 years. Some of them have been in the health and food arena, partnering with the World Health Organization, Catholic Relief Services, the Federation of International Education, mainly aimed in some of these lesser projects to provide health and nutrition for teachers involved in Haiti. But for the last 15 years, there have been 3 projects that I want to say just a word about that are the direct delivery of curriculum and new pedagogy to students. Beginning in 1997, for a period of 5 years, EDC provided what was called multi-channel learning in Creole for the first 3 grade levels in Haiti, but aimed also at the education of the teachers themselves. And these were largely delivered by interactive radio. It's not interactive between some radio station someplace. It's interactivity within the classroom as the teachers and the students together move through disciplined sequential study in Creole, in mathematics, in reading and writing, and also content knowledge. Over 100,000 students were included in this program for 5 years. Funded by USAID, it was extended in 2003 for another 5 years at the next 6 grade levels. That focus was on basic and secondary education. Beginning in 2003, we developed a program called IDIGEN, which is the Out-of-School Youth Livelihood Initiative, also funded by USAID. And I did bring some flyers on that program to put in front of you. The target audience for this program were the 450,000 young people, ages 15 to 24, in Haiti who are functionally illiterate. If they've had at most a 3-year education, which didn't take in most cases, but the majority of these young people have had no exposure to education whatsoever before. We'd only reached 14,000 of these young people by this year when the project, the funding will end. But it's really been an extraordinary experience where in a 2-year period, the young people are given 18 months of training and education in centers throughout Haiti in the same fields of arithmetic, mathematics, reading, writing, and also life skills, teamwork, conflict resolution, confidence building as well, followed by a 6-month accompaniment period where the students have mentoring to choose either for continuing education or for social enterprise. We're working with Foncosi, the microfinance company in Haiti, as a transition, or developing, securing jobs. There's a strong vocational component to this program, especially in building trades, plumbing, masonry, tile laying, framing, electricity, and so forth. We reached 14,000 students. It's just a drop in the bucket, but is an example of another way of addressing at a new, creative, and fundamental level both the literacy needs and vocational job preparedness for this population. I'm sad to say that the U.S. government, the State Department, and the U.S. Agency for International Development has decided not to continue this program or to provide any supplemental funding for education in the billion-dollar package that they're putting forward for reconstruction and development in Haiti. I'll say more about that in a moment. In its last phase, and we still have a month to go, we've mobilized these young people for creating safe child and youth centers in Port-au-Prince, and also to the cleanup and some rebuilding activities within the city. There were 200 community-based organizations involved in this project throughout Haiti, church organizations and other associations, and it really was capacity building. We hope and expect that it will continue without U.S. government support, and we're doing everything that we can, working with other entrepreneurs to really nationalize and perpetuate this as a freestanding NGO within Haiti. The ethos for education is absolutely extraordinary in Haiti. As you know, the stories are full of pathos and ethos when people in the 70% of the population of Haiti that live on less than $2 a day are committing half of that so that their children can afford to go to school. Proportionately, that's a commitment to education far beyond what any of us can imagine here. I was talking with a person from the World Bank yesterday who said investing $1 in education has the greatest efficacy of any development activities. And you could fill in the blanks with the others. The results of similar work around, not only that we do, but other organizations like ours in Africa and South Asia are manifest. That 2 years education for a young woman can dramatically reduce sexually transmitted diseases, postpone marriage and childbearing, reduce birth rates, increase household income and productivity, not only ethically, but also financially. It's a very, very strong investment in education. A couple quick data about the educational challenge in Haiti. The adult population in Haiti is 53% literate. The next lowest in the Western Hemisphere is Nicaragua at 67%. There are many West African countries that have higher literacy rates than Haiti does today. Add to this a rapidly growing population. 50% of Haitians are under age 20, 70% are under age 30. The fertility rate has not declined as it does in most other developing countries. It's 4 children per woman at this point. And the youth tsunami is continuing to come. 55% of school-age children are not attending school in Haiti right now. Of those that do attend, 90% have to rely on private schools, and thus the demand on personal income for uniforms and the rudiments of attending school. Only 20% of the teachers in these schools are formally prepared. On average, the students lag 2 grade levels behind in performance. There are virtually no national standards for education or for accreditation at either the elementary, secondary, or the tertiary level. Haiti is in need of a massive reformation or refounding, as President Preval would call it, in the educational field. We and organizations like ours certainly have been promoting earnestly the importance of education as the U.S. government, State Department, and AID consider both its core funding and supplementary funding. The core aid budget for Haiti next year will be around $300 million. Less than 4% of that is directed to education. None of the supplementary funding for Haiti coming from USAID is in the area of education. These are tough decisions that people are making, to be sure, and the preference that the U.S. government is showing for energy and health and agriculture certainly are commendable. The French and the Canadians in the international conferences have volunteered and have been given the responsibility for educational development. And it's commendable for them to do so. However, it's highly unfortunate that the U.S. is not stepping forward in this way. We have been more willing than any of the other governments to experiment in education. We alone have shown true educational leadership in Haiti in the past. The U.S. takes an inclusive view of problem solving and innovation through education that is pluralistic, comprehensive, that includes public and private partnerships, that includes health and civil society as well as basic disciplines. And we have had a very high standard or very high focus on standards and capacity building as well. This is not the way educators in Haiti have thought before, but it is, I think, fundamentally important that it should be there now for the same reasons that Thomas Jefferson asked on his tombstone to be carved not President of the United States, but founder of the University of Virginia, that it really is time for a strong educational initiative and agenda. I want to give one example of how transformation can occur and then tell you who I think should be at the table. One of the most interesting experiences that I've had in the 4 years I've been at EDC was in Mali, where we've been working with the government to reform education in Mali, which also has a French colonial heritage. Very, very low literacy rates in Mali, and particularly low for women. But the government has committed itself as part of the Education for All Millennium Development Goals to do something about that. And they began with geographic mapping. It's extraordinary what you can do from the air. Mali thought they had about 10,000 villages. When we did the mapping, it turns out they have something like 16,000 villages, and laid those demographics on top of where the school resources are. If a school is more than 3 miles from a student, the student will not attend that school. Thomas Jefferson actually had a school placed within a 3-mile distance of anyone in his grid for education. Significant data point. Another handicap in Mali was this rigid notion that every grade level needs its own classroom and needs its own teacher. As the product myself of a one-room country school in rural Minnesota with 15 kids in 6 grades and 1 teacher for all 6 years, I'm a little skeptical about this. We brought the Malian education officials to the United States actually to visit some one-room schools. There are still a few around here. And they are restructuring education now based on demographics and the availability or not of teachers to having 2, 3, or 6 teacher schools for 6 grade levels depending on population density. And at the national level, in their teachers' academies, are training them to work in what really is a Montessori-like environment and quite extraordinary. There is a lot of practice, a lot of experience, a lot of innovation out there, particularly in the United States, that we would like to bring to the further support and revolution of education in Haiti. There are 3 organizations, all of these are associations, that we would like to be more at the table. One is the Basic Education Coalition, which is an organization of about 20 NGOs like EDC that have significant experience on basic education outside the United States. Another is a new organization called the Youth Development Alliance, which is meeting again in Washington, D.C. next week, and at the university level is Higher Education in Development, a relatively new organization in association with the American Council on Education. With great respect to the hard decisions that are being made in Washington and elsewhere and among the international donor community, who are all responding very, very earnestly, I really hope that in every way possible as individuals, and also as organizations, that we can find ways to continue to bring the experience of the U.S. educational community to bear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And thank you, students and visitors, for coming to hear my remarks. At my age, it's a big compliment to have somebody listen to me. But let me tell you why I presume to come to discuss with you coping with disaster, long-term strategies for Haiti. I have been a regular visitor to Haiti since 1950, before most of you were born or even thought of. In other words, I have been going to Haiti for the past 60 years. And for 40 of those 60 years, I've been married to a Haitian who is a direct descendant of Toussaint Louverture, Haiti's liberator, and a descendant also of the wife of the tyrannical Haitian emperor, Henri Christophe. Sadly, and here's another recent connection, sadly, as a result of the recent earthquake, I lost a brother-in-law, Marcel Toussaint, and more than a dozen friends and acquaintances. Now, in addressing the subject of today's forum, it is essential that we deal realistically, and the emphasis is on realism, with the total lack of Haiti's resources to deal with the consequences of the earthquake disaster. Haiti has a population of 9 million people, roughly, who have lived in poverty and under a succession of oppressive regimes since its hard-earned independence in 1804. Haiti was the second independent country in the Western Hemisphere after the United States. Not many people know that. And to appreciate the gravity of this situation, compare Haiti with Denmark, which has a population of 3.5 million fewer people than Haiti. Haiti has no history, none, of responsible governments that have been concerned with the well-being of the Haitian people. Typically, a succession of Haitian governments have been corrupt, guilty of human rights violations, typified by assassinations, and most important, both scorned and exploited by our own country, the United States. Prior to the recent earthquake, Haitians lacked an infrastructure that provided the Haitian people with such basic needs as public sanitation, potable water, electricity, reliable telecommunications, roads, education, as we were talking of just before, agricultural self-sufficiency, or protection from such regularly recurring natural disasters as flooding and hurricanes. Since the 1970s, unlike neighboring Dominican Republic, Haiti has had virtually no tourism as a source of revenue and employment for Haiti's people. It has just disappeared. Remember that even as recently as the 1970s, Hillary and Bill Clinton spent their honeymoon in Haiti. Not many people are going to Haiti these days for honeymoons. What little manufacturing for export that Haiti has had has been limited to the assembly, mostly, I should say, the assembly of garments destined for the United States, made by Haitian laborers for deplorably low wages, for sale in the United States at enormous profits, a clear case of exploitation of labor. Now, on the brighter side, and there has to be a bright side to almost every tragedy, on the bright side is the steady exodus of poor and middle-class Haitians out of Haiti to the United States, Canada, and France principally, where they have taken advantage of the economic and educational opportunity available to them. As a result, it's not unusual to see Haitian immigrants abroad in such professions as law, medicine, engineering, architecture, teaching, and business. A shining example of these expatriate Haitians, or Haitians from the diaspora as they're commonly referred to, is the brilliant Haitian lady, Michaëlle Jean, who is the present Governor General of Canada. These Haitian expatriates have so much to contribute to the rebuilding of their homeland. Then, last January 12th, came the disastrous earthquake that destroyed all, and I emphasize all, of Haiti's minimal resources and compounded Haiti's enormous basic needs, leaving the country without a functioning government and in desperate need of such basic means of survival as housing, medical care, public sanitation, food, potable water, and law and order. As a result of the earthquake, we cannot forget that 4,000 criminals escaped from Haiti's prisons and are still at liberty today, creating chaos and insecurity among the survivors of the earthquake. Worse yet, the earthquake also devastated the resources and killed 101 members of the United Nations staff, a staff that was responsible for guaranteeing the peace and security of Haiti. Included in those tragic statistics are the chief of the United Nations mission in Haiti. The outpouring of emergency relief from the nations of the world was most remarkable. However, it was complicated by a lack of coordination, I should say is complicated by a lack of coordination and collaboration that is only now being improved. All of this improvement is now being threatened or threatened by a compromise as a result of the oncoming rainy and hurricane seasons, which are just weeks away, I should say. There has been an incredible pledging of nearly $10 billion You heard me, $10 billion in foreign aid from the nations of the world. I think that money must be administered and controlled by the United Nations, not by the Haitian government, using the opportunity to train an entirely new cadre of Haitian civil servants. Those funds must not go into the hands of the Haitian National Treasury, where they will be stolen. The funds must not be accessible to the current band of Haitian politicians and government officials. Turning to the Haitian business elite, that elite must be involved in the planning and in the execution of Haiti's recovery. Why do I say that? In order to boost the local economic recovery, the business sector must be involved in construction, road building, and agriculture, just to name a couple of sectors. Haiti does not have the luxury of dealing with the enormous, underscore enormous, variety of its needs one after the other. All of Haiti's needs must be addressed simultaneously. And this is the major challenge to Haiti and its significant donors. Also, and this is very important, the UN oversight of Haiti's recovery, which I propose, must be treated as a long-term project requiring at least an initial commitment of 25 years. Most important, and here's the real difficult part, that recovery effort must involve a significant turnover of Haiti's national sovereignty to the United Nations. This is unprecedented and a sacrifice hitherto unknown and a major challenge to the modern world. Most important, Haiti must move from a pattern of dependence on international charity to the start, at least the start, of Haitian self-sufficiency. Now, I have not painted a very pretty picture. I did not intend to do so. I hope I have painted a realistic picture. You may not agree with my conclusions, but I hope at least to have stimulated your thinking. Thank you for listening to me. Excuse me. Yes. Hello, is it on? Okay. The UN has been in Haiti for now some 7 years with the challenge not of providing the kind of development of the governmental institutions, the economy, the social institutions, and the infrastructure that I've been talking about. Its sole responsibility has been for the maintenance of law and order, which it has done admirably, thanks to the presence of some 8,000 primarily Brazilian troops there, donated by Brazil to the United Nations. So I would not deplore the United Nations. It has not had the task of carrying out the kind of responsibilities that I think a government should carry out, and which the government of Haiti has totally failed to do.
Shed any light on that, I'd be happy. Thank you so much.
Would you like it? Okay. The military have one thing that none of the other organizations that you've mentioned have at their disposal, and that is military discipline. uh, the military can rally and organize in ways, because of that discipline, that voluntary organizations can't. They cannot impose that kind of discipline. Coming back to your remarks about the Red Cross, the Red Cross has for years been criticized for its high administrative costs. And I don't know whether it's 8 cents on every dollar that is used effectively. Whatever it is, it's an awfully big chunk of whatever you donate to the Red Cross goes to covering salaries and the like, not for doing good works. But that's not the case with every relief organization. I personally am familiar with Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, which does an excellent job. And by the way, nobody in the American media has yet given credit to Cuba, which was the first country to respond to Haiti. There are 310 Cuban doctors now in Haiti, not working in comfortable circumstances, but out in the hustings. They were there, many of them were there before the earthquake, more are there afterwards. And boy, oh boy, if the Cubans can do it, why can't the rest of us?
Thank you for the question. I think you partly answered that, but I will just say a couple of words. Understand that immediately after the independence, Haiti was sort of, as Ambassador Haynes mentioned, the second independent nation in the Western Hemisphere after the United States. Remember, during that period of time, there were three major revolutions. One, 1776, the American Revolution, that some historians usually refer to as the American, War of Independence, because the ideals of the revolution, as we all know, liberty and pursuit of happiness. And of course, the U.S. had slaves, and the founding fathers still had slaves. We can't go to that. The second one was the 1789, the French Revolution, which also had the idea of liberté, égalité, fraternité. Again, these ideals were not, forthcoming because the French had colonies, they maintained slavery all over. But he worked with the tradition. That was the beginning of modernity, in terms of enlightenment. It says two things: no to slavery, that means no man should own another man or woman; no to colonialism, no country should own another country. Now, being the first black independent republic in the hemisphere was also fighting, colonialism throughout the Saint tried to help the Maroon in Jamaica, tried to help, Bolivar and so forth, was a way to consolidate its own, revolution, its own movement, as looking for friends around the bloc and to maintain and to push that, kind of ideals. But again, remember, General de Gaulle once said, countries have no friends, countries have interest. To the extent that you have somebody like Pétion who said, look, the only thing we're asking you to do, that's what he told Bolivar, he gave him 300 munitions, a printing press, and soldiers. He told him the only thing we ask you to do when you liberate those countries in Latin America, which he did, Panama, Venezuela, and so forth, is to liberate the slaves. I think that was very altruistic, because in modern days, somebody will say, look, man, so 10% of every land you get. So the Haitian leaders were not about profiting from that. It was really, something, as we said, of necessity, and also trying to do this kind of deed. He could have said, Victor Bolivar, on every land you get free, 10%, 20%. You reimburse us, what we gave you as a nation. But it wasn't that. Now, what I'm trying to point out is that historically, Haiti was not a pariah in terms of, being the beggar around the world. So I have a tendency to tell folks, I think, what happened in January 12 make it vivid, that in fact, as we point out, all three of us, in terms of, the lack of responsibility from the leaders. The country has never been ruled, with love. It's always been predatory or prebendary, and you have a succession of leaders, coup, counter coup, and and then of course stealing of money in conjunction with it's internal and external, supported by also external forces. When Haitian leaders steal the money, send it to Swiss bank, we provide them plane to fly them to France to live in Kenya. So we know that. Now the idea is basically to think of nowadays that Haiti is facing what it's facing. I think it's important to the rest of the world to understand that they should be in solidarity with Haiti. but not maintaining the same kind of assistentialism, because I think it will further and further, as I think all of us mentioned, create a kind of dependency deeper and deeper, which we don't want to do and we shouldn't be doing. Because right now in Haiti, folks are waiting for the $5.3 billion that the world community is offering. So nobody's doing anything until the money is coming, which I think we didn't do after independence. After independence, we pull, our sleeves, and then we start working and we build the country without no help, without no aid. It's obvious, as Ambassador pointed out, we cannot do it. The magnitude is so. But I think it's important for the rest of the world that, in solidarity, in accompaniment in Haiti, I think Haitians will be able to do it. And at the end of the day, they will have to do it and put it themselves. If they're waiting for some, Deus ex machina to come down with the money, with the know-how, I think we're there for a long, long haul. And I think that's the idea. I think, as you said, yeah, of course, this is this kind of support we need. This is this kind of a solidarity we need from the rest of the world. So Haitians can move and then, of course, becoming responsible nations, and then also have responsible government and also responsible civil society, and they can, we can take them off the, welfare wall. Because, as a taxpayer, I am also very troubled that our tax dollars here is going down to a country in a whole. Because we know exactly the leaders, we know they are responsible, but yet we continue to channel the money. And then so as a taxpayer, I think that we should be saying, look, if we cannot see transparency, we cannot see accountability, that every money, every dollar that Haitian government receives, whether it's under the leadership of the UN or the Haitian government, it should be posted on a website. That any Haitian citizen can go on that website and see how much money is there. And then, just like your checkbook, when you write a check, you know where you spend the money. So everybody knows exactly where every dollar goes, and where is it, can we, check that word to see, that word is, cost the money that we pay for it. So that's what I'm saying in terms of that solidarity that we need.
That commitment of 25 years to the United Nations is another way to have a big, powerful country occupy Haiti.
No, I don't think so. I am not. I am calling for a special United Nations administration to function as the government of Haiti for a transitional period, to make sure that the money that is committed, some $10 billion that has been committed by the world community of nations, is spent for what it is intended, and that is to improve the lot of the people of Haiti, not to end up in banks in Switzerland, as Dr. Brew mentioned, because the pattern in the past has been for that money to end up in foreign banks, and a whole succession of Haitian leaders is living abroad currently on the money that has been stolen from the country. So I am not advocating that the United States or any particular member nation of the United Nations have control of that administration. It must be a truly independent United Nations entity, which at the same time is involved in training Haitians in roles as honest civil servants dedicated to the good of the people of their country.
I think it's that last part that is especially instructive, because when you first hear this, it sounds shocking to some people, but the question is, what would be the role of the Haitian people? How can we guarantee that they are being brought into these positions so that at some date certain, they will resume full control over the government? I think that's the gap
but the important element is that at the same time that there will be an administration of these funds directed by the United Nations entity, there must be a training component so that Haitians know how to administer. Because right now, there is, if you ever go to a Haitian government entity, agency, for help on something as simple as getting a deed to property, it is a nightmare. Mm-hmm. They don't know what they're doing. Not because they're stupid, but because they have never, ever in all their history been trained. Well, that training has to start now.
I think the question, I think as you asked the last part, is important. I think on the minds of many Haitians, it will be, giving your sovereignty. But I think what's important to understand, perhaps, is the idea of thinking of how will we build this nation or help this nation to be rebuilt in terms of, strengthening its capacity. And then how do we do that? We know it's difficult with the current leadership, because the current leadership, we've seen what they've done over the past decade. And then we're not sure whether they are really up, to step up to the plate. So in other words, I think the idea would be perhaps to think, can you turn a lion into a vegetarian overnight? Is it possible to think that, okay, now that disaster happened, now all the guys who were prior to the earthquake were not really concerned about the wealth of this nation, the well-being of this nation. Now all of a sudden, you're going to pool money, and they're going to be concerned about the, we've seen the last disaster that happened in Haiti, the hurricane. There were $200 million rather given to the country to begin to rebuild its capacity in terms of, post-disaster kind of emergency. Overnight, the $200 million disappeared. That's what caused the downfall of the former Prime Minister, Michel Pierre. When they asked the Prime Minister said, I don't know. The bank director, I don't know. Minister of Finance, nobody knows. There's no accountability. Nobody's going to bring anyone to court to, ask them, transparency and accountability. So I think, there's a fear from the standpoint of the international community feeling that, can you put that amount of money into the current existing government or the leaders who are there right now, which in fact, if you know that the bulk of the population somewhat distant because they see that they were not prior to the disaster, how can they overnight become responsible? So perhaps the idea of some kind of guardianship, whatever you want to call it, because at the founders meeting, you could see clearly the nations who were on the table. The nations who were on the table were basically France, Canada, the US, Spain, and Brazil, because of MINUSTAH and so forth. Haiti was not really the driver's seat. It's the idea of play to pay, pay to play. If you cannot pay, you can't play. So the Haitian leaders who were there, they were just in the backseat. Questions were being asked, to Prime Minister Belleville. President Clinton was responding because feeling so that, in fact, Haiti was still not quite up to the task because the leadership was there. Whether they're still shocked, they lost their family members, we know that. But I think it's important fundamentally to see in the past 20 decades of this nation, you've never really had clear leaders who were, there were a few, but in fact, you never had that, clear leadership and concern. So that's the concern the international community has, which I think, Ambassador Hayes is pointing, which is not, his, original proposal. I think I've heard this in many discussions in terms of, debate, whether they're calling it about its receivership or, the different euphemism. But something has to be done if you want to rebuild. But I'm convinced that I think everyone here is convinced you have to rebuild the state. We're not talking about this government or that government or former government, but the state must be rebuilt in some capacity. And then so we've got to make differentiation between the state and the government, because the state will remain, government will move and change. But present individuals who are right now at the helms of the state and the government, particularly, you have to rebuild the institutions, all the institutions that we know have been decayed. Not only in terms of physical, but I think in terms of the superstructure, what it is in terms of changing the mindset of individuals who are in these powers. It's interesting to see how all these government buildings, collapse. The DGI, which your IRS collapsed. The central level of the government, the office collapsed. All the ministries collapsed. The only thing that's standing, you could see, are the statue of the leaders that are still standing and watching over what's happening. So something is wrong. It amounts to what you consider to be as a revolution. What happened in France with the Bastille, shut down everything and closed down and collapsing everything. That's exactly what happened. So you have to rebuild. And how do you rebuild that? That's the major question. Do we pull money? Do you feed and continue to feed a dead horse? Or you try to do something different? So that's the major crux. So,
John? Let me add a couple of suggestions for further reading as a one-time university professor. Two books that I have found very insightful. One is Terry Buss's Haiti in the Balance, Why Foreign Aid Has Failed and What We Can Do About It. Interestingly, published by the National Academy of Public Administration. And the observation, the thesis is this: the lack of trained professional, civil infrastructure and public administration, how we get there, another consideration. And then also, the ambassador's comments about the lack of experience with property ownership and private capital reminded me of Fernando de Soto's The Mystery of Capital as well, which I found very insightful as applies not just to Haiti, but elsewhere. What we take so, for example, here about the route to acquiring and building upon capital, how incredibly labyrinthine and inefficient it is in Haiti, and many governments that don't enjoy the political and legal traditions that we're the beneficiaries of.
You're talking about in terms of being able to lead this country and being able to provide some of the things that needs to be provided. Why is it that Haitian Americans could not do so?
There's a very sad but succinct answer to that question. And it's one that I really have no patience with. I can understand it intellectually, but I have no patience with it. I have heard this from members of my own family in Haiti. When confronted with the enormous expertise that Haitians of the diaspora have to offer Haiti today and have had to offer Haiti for quite a long time, Haitians who remain in Haiti and who are in power resent this and say, don't come back here and tell us how to solve our problems. We've stayed here and suffered. You haven't paid your dues. There is an animosity which I do not understand on the part of Haitians in Haiti in positions of power towards Haitians of the diaspora. Paradoxically, they would rather see some Blanc from Europe or the United States come back to Haiti and do exactly what Haitians from the diaspora could do. Very often, they were very poor people, the children of people who were servants, who got out of Haiti and who realized that the only way to make it in the New World was through the education of their children. And they achieved enormous professional advancement through education. And then not to have it welcomed back in Haiti, I don't understand it.
I think it's a very interesting question. It's a question that I think people who are in diasporic studies in migration try to respond to and answer. It's a question that I raised in an article that I wrote in 2005 from Latin American Studies, asking the same question. Why is it that Haitians all around the world, Canada and France and wherever, succeed and become very, prominent, and they can't do that in Haiti? It's something now we begin to look at in terms of thinking at, the space, whether the institutions, that are the context they're working in. I'll give you a simple example, for instance. Flying to Haiti, I'm in the Miami airport, everybody's in line, okay? As soon as the plane landed in Haiti, I was with my mother, and people moving, I'm standing in line. My mother said, what's wrong with you? I said, I'm waiting for my turn. He said, you never get anywhere, you got to get, so then the Haitian began to push themselves. And there's no law, no order whatsoever. Now, I think the idea of, the first part of the question, I'm going to try to respond to that a bit and then get back to that diaspora thing. Well, let's deal with the diaspora. First of all, we don't have a homogeneous diaspora when you think about Haitian diaspora. People from the DR, people from Bahamas, people from all the other Caribbean islands, and even within the United States, the context of people who are from New York versus those in Boston versus in Miami. There's all these folks in France and Canada. So then you don't really have, in terms of sort of a common diasporic consensus of what we're going to do and what we're going to do. And then even within the diaspora, you have Haitians who are thinking of, at this time when there's tragedy in Haiti, it's a time for me to go and down to Haiti and cash in. They're not looking at it in terms of really going and helping rebuild. So the idea that the people from the diaspora are sending $1.2 billion every year to the country, to their own family, which is not really helping in terms of any kind of national development, because there's no consensus on the part of the government to really make that something that would become more within a national development scheme. Like for instance in Mexico, for every dollar that a Mexican sends, the local government match it with $1 and the national government match it with second. So that means $3 in total. Then, so that helps in terms of development. But for Haitians, it's family to family, it's individual, and they see you as a cash cow. And then that's the mindset. Even the Constitution, the diaspora individual from the diaspora nation been fighting to have a voice in terms of what it is. People talk about dual citizenship, but that will never happen because folks in Haiti see it as the ambassador said, you're a threat. You're coming here to either take over because you have the know-how, you have the capital. Stay over there, send it to us. We'll take care of it. We really don't need you. Even if you look at the commission that is put together currently, okay, of 21 members, there is one slot for the diaspora, but it's observing. They don't have no vote. So now everybody else have a voting right in that commission of rebuilding, but the diaspora has a member which has no power, no vote. And so I think you can see there's always this kind of a disconnect in that. In fact, that's something that the nation would have to come to grip in terms of understanding the resources, the wealth, and also the know-how, how we can bring. And then of course, to also understand members of the diaspora, wherever you may be, to see exactly what it is that we want to do when we return and to what extent we want to give our services. The first part of the question talking about independence, I totally agree with you in terms of, yes, the first Black Republic independent, in terms of the sentimental historical context that people would not want to relinquish. But understand that also, though Haiti's been independent since 1804, politically, but economically, the country's been independent for many, many years. Socially, culturally, there's been a dependency that exists, to the extent that you cannot produce sufficient to feed your population. You have to be important. Of course, there were, implication, as Bill Clinton apologized the other day, when he was president, that he favored, rice dumping so he could help. We know what happened in terms of, USAID plot in the 1980s against the Haitian small banking system to the peasantry and the killing of the pigs and so forth. So we know, but there were also internal elements. The government were in place, signed those contracts. They were supporting. They were, in other words, you didn't have outsiders coming in and force it down. But rather you had internal elements who were agreeing and went with it. So I think it's more complex, and there are no really simple solution to these complex issues. As the diaspora or the independency, that is something that is in fact important, but yet we know there's been dependency economically. The country cannot balance its budget without international aid or some kind of a grant and foreign aid, either from IDB, World Bank, and so forth and so on. So I think these are issues that I think we need to come to grip with. To the extent you're asking the international community to finance, for instance, your election, I mean, God forbid, then they have to intervene to tell you, we don't want anyone other than someone that we feel will represent, our money. Because they're investing. Because it's a pay to play. If you cannot pay, you can't play. So if the Haitian government cannot, pay, they cannot be around the table and dictate, what should be done and how it should be done.
That for just a moment, education doesn't sound like a quick fix, and it's probably not either. It is certainly a matter of structure and standards and evaluation, but it also is, and this was part of Thomas Jefferson's inspiration as well, ground up and based on the independence, independence of mind, the independence of property, the independence of voting of so many people, which lies behind the Millennium Development Goal also of universal basic education. And we have a long way to go in the world at large, with 73 million young people still not having access to any quality of education at all. But countries in almost as desperate circumstances as Haiti is right now are making progress, a number of them in Western Africa. In West Africa, for example, I think there's encouragement and models that can be borrowed from some places, but so long as it's kind of pouring new wine into old skins of the same plans and ministries and expectations, which are tremendously inefficient by and large, that's not going to happen. And together with or aside from the governments that are coming together for these coalitions. I think that we also need to bring to the table associations. I just learned from Mark a moment ago that the University of Massachusetts Boston apparently is working with higher education in development, a new organization out of, based in Washington, D.C., that taps in 1,500 American colleges and universities through the Academy, or through ACE, what does ACE stand for? I should remember. The American Council on Education. The willingness is there by education, innovators and experts and associations in this country to help. And we do have channels through associations, I think, that could be very beneficial if they were at the table as well. I was concerned that the kind of parceling out of, okay, France and Canada, you take education, and the United States will take energy and agriculture and health, that's not going to get it done.